QSO Today, episode 332, Wayne Yoshida, KH6WZ. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers and accessories for the radio amateur, reminding you to check out their new IC705 all-band portable transceiver and their new ID52A dual-band portable, both shipping now. My thanks to ICOM America for their continued support of the QSO Today podcast. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, 4Z1UG, your host. Flex Radio is a platinum sponsor of the upcoming QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo that will return in March 2021. We have updated the technology platform for the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo to make it even more user-friendly using video chat. If you have a ham radio business or organization and want to engage over 10,000 amateurs, by last count, like Flex Radio, in our expo, please contact me for the best ways to engage your customers and audience. Wayne Yoshida, KH6WZ, has been an active ham since the 1970s, growing up in Los Angeles. Wayne is a home brewer, especially microwave equipment on 10 gigahertz, and has taken our amateur radio hobby to the Maker Faire in the Bay Area for live demonstrations. As a technical writer and contributing editor to CQ magazine, Wayne is in one of the best places to experience just about everything in ham radio. KH6WZ is my QSO today. KH6WZ, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Wayne?
Good evening. Yes, I am. Thank you for having me on the show.
Wayne, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, let's see. This could be a funny story. I actually learned about ham radio through magazines, right? So for Popular Electronics being one, and I can't for the life of me remember the stories that were written. I think it's not Tom and Jerry, but it's something like that. Anyway, it's a story about two ham radio kids, and they were talking about adventures and things like that. And of course, Popular Electronics had a ham radio column in there, and it starts off with my parents would tell me funny stories about, whenever the family got together during the holidays. And one of the things they would say was that I spent a lot of time behind the TV set rather than actually watching it, right? So I was fascinated with looking at the glowing vacuum tubes inside and the, feeling the warmth of the TV set and that weird high-pitched noise that came from the thing. And of course, that electronic smell one smells, right? When smelling electronic equipment. And so that was probably my first inkling of what I was interested in, right? So, and, when my mother would go to the grocery store to go shopping, I would go with her, but I would kind of, ditch her and stand by the magazine stand and read Popular Electronics and I think it's Electronics Illustrated and probably Electronics World. Most all those magazines are gone, but that was probably where I got exposed to ham radio and electronics. And I was just fascinated by all that stuff. And at about 9 or 10 years old, I was a subscriber to Popular Electronics. And I thought it was pretty funny. One day, I can't remember if it was weekday or weekend, but I was, sitting in the living room reading Popular Electronics magazine, and a salesman, somebody knocked at the door. My mom answered, and it was a sales guy for the Cleveland Institute of Electronics, CIE. And because he found me as a subscriber to Popular Electronics, he came to the house and he asked my mom if I was home, and that was unusual. I still remember the guy's face when I came to the door because he was asking for me, and it turns out that he was a sales guy for the Cleveland Institute of Electronics, and I was a 10-year-old kid. So I don't know. I to this day, I wonder what would have happened if I enrolled, or if they would even have let me do that. But that was pretty funny.
How did you become a ham radio operator? Did you find a mentor or someone like that saw you reading Popular Electronics at the supermarket magazine stand?
It's not quite as interesting as that. In fact, it was a long time before I actually got a ham license, right? So this is probably, like I said, when I was about 10 or so years old, 9 or 10. But it wasn't until I got to high school. Well, let's go back. In our school system, we have elementary school, junior high school, and high school, right? So In junior high school, this would have been 7th grade, and this is when we finally get shop class. And this was shop class back then, which is hugely a mistake that we don't have this anymore. So, of course, the favorite one, of course, was for me was always electric shop, and I always took it. Well, again, same thing, right? I got really tired of making blinky light projects. And I think in the 10th grade is where I met 2 guys with ham radio license. One of them was George, who you've had on the podcast. And George Zafiropoulos, right, back then was WA6CMM. So he actually was past his novice class back then. And Bob Adams, KA7CRE, I don't know if he upgraded his call or not. George is KJ6VU now. And so when I met those 2 guys, of course, our projects were way beyond the blinky light projects. And I remember Bob building a variable power supply, and I made a code practice oscillator. And that's when I got more excited about ham radio. And that's when I started getting to this, but still didn't get my license. It wasn't until my, I'm going to say 11th grade year, junior year in high school, that I met somebody through, of all places, a newspaper, throwaway junk newspaper called The Penny Saver. And I don't know if it even exists today, but The Penny Saver is a newspaper thing. It's filled with classified ads. That's all you see there of used stuff that people want to get. And for some reason, I picked it up and I read through this thing. And there was a really tiny ad. I think it was like maybe 2 lines. And it started off with, interested in ham radio or want to learn Morse code? And it was, contact this guy and with his phone number. Turns out that Bob Miles, and his call sign back then was WA6LLW. He's retired, and I think he moved to Utah, and I've lost track of him. But turned out that this Elmer guy lived within bicycle distance of my house. So that's kind of nice because, back then when you're a kid in high school, you don't have a car, or at least I didn't. My mode of transport is my bicycle. And that's where I finally got, he gave me code practice tapes. Back then we had to learn the Morse code. And he said 2 or 3 weeks practicing every day and you'll know it. And I didn't believe it. I was pretty skeptical about his advice about learning Morse code. But he gave me the Codemaster brand of code tapes, and I listened to it, and I actually did learn it. I learned enough so I can pass the exam. Bob was the guy who gave me my novice test, and he looked at it and he says, "Yep, you passed. Congratulations." And it was all of a sudden, it was sort of a no big deal. I studied really hard for this test, but the actual exam was much easier than I thought it would be, and it was easy to pass. So I guess that's one piece of encouragement for anybody who thinks or might be afraid or scared of the ham radio test. It really isn't that.
Well, let's go back just a second, and because we're talking like some periods of time, and for our younger listeners, they may not know when you talk about blinky lights in electronics class. As I recall, this is like the late 60s, early 70s. These were called color organs.
Yes, color organs.
They were sound-powered, used SCRs or triacs for controlling of electric Christmas lights.
Right.
Of 3 different colors. And they were popular everywhere.
Yeah, that's right. This was probably 1972, 73, 74, something like this. In fact, 73, of course, has a special meaning for hams, as everybody knows. And I still have commemorative stamps for 1973 World DX Friendship Year, because back then, of course, I was a shortwave listener. So I guess we can call one of my rigs was a transoceanic, right? It was a black suitcase thing, and I got it used. It was in pretty bad shape, but it was kind of neat to listen to BBC and Radio Canada and Radio Japan and things like this. And of course, whenever I showed this to all of my friends, the first thing that they would ask me is, "Well, can you talk?" And then I would say, no. And then everybody says, "Well, who cares?" Right? So that was another motivator for me to get away from shortwave listening and get into the ham license, because then you can say, yeah, I can talk to these people on the other side.
So how old were you when you got your first ham license, and what was the call sign?
Yeah, let's see. I was 17. 1976 was the year. Of course, we need to know year first license for the radio contest, right? Like sweepstakes.
And what was your call sign?
My call sign was, this was the interesting part. Back then, novice licensees had Whiskey November call signs, WN for novice. However, when my license happened, or that year in 76, they issued me a recycled call sign with no N in it. So my very first call sign was Whiskey Alpha 6 SGH, Signal Go Haywire. It was never on the air. So, but, of course, I had my ham license finally, and then my family moved. So, there went my friends, George and Bob. So I got stuck going to electric shop again in a different high school with no hams in it, and a shop teacher who kind of didn't care.
Or didn't know.
Didn't know about ham radio, yes. Okay. My electric shop teacher back then I think he was the metal shop guy. And so I sort of had the reputation in the shop class where I knew more than the teacher did.
Where did you move, Wayne? Did you move out of state, or did you just move across town?
That's a good question. Yeah, I met George and Bob back in Venice High School in Los Angeles, California. Family moved to Orange County, California, in Fountain Valley, and went to La Quinta High School in Westminster, California.
At that time, if you weren't a ham, so we can put it in context, I mean, right now it's across town from Los Angeles to Fountain Valley. But in those days, I was also subject to being moved around at the same time. Without ham radio, if you were moving from one side of town to the other, like from one part of the basin to the other, it was like moving to Mars. You were away from your friends forever, unless they were on ham radio.
Well, that's true. And mostly because, as a kid, we don't have much of a choice, right? Our parents determine where we go, where we live, and what school we go to, right? We had no choice, and so it was pretty disruptive to everything. And of course, timing for me was especially bad because I was in my junior year. So part of my high school experience, like the prom, for example, wasn't very good because I missed that because I didn't have an established friend base back there. The athletic team back then was horrible, and Venice High School back then had a really good reputation. I believe it still does. A lot of Olympic athletes came from that high school away. But this little dinky Orange County high school, no offense to La Quinta alumni out there, but, not the same.
So you're this teenager that has an interest in electronics. You have your first ham license. Did ham radio play a part at all in the choices that you made for a career in education?
The answer to that is yes. So when I got to high school, and because of my ham radio experience and studying to take the test and understanding Ohm's law and Watt's law and things like this, and taking electric shop, learning about very similar things, including math, one of my weeks, but that's another subject. But yeah, it drove me to things in science, right? So I took all the science classes and so forth, and I especially liked my chemistry and physics classes. And I still remember this, right? One day after taking a physics exam in high school, the teacher called me after class and wanted to speak to me, right? And that's never it. So Mr. Leonard asked me, he said, "Hey, you're getting C's and D's in algebra, and yet you're making A's and B's in my class." And I said, "Well, a lot of these things we're learning right now, I've learned before when I was probably about, 10 or 12 years old because of my interest in ham radio." And I said Ohm's law and Watt's law and things like this. And, although we didn't study the wave or particle theory in ham radio exams and so forth, part of the things I remember or enjoy are the demonstrations that you put on. Of course, rubbing his ego to help me out of this jam. And I said, that's part of the thing. It's learning about, formulas and working them out. And I didn't know this at the time. It wasn't until I got to something like the third year of college that I found out that I have a learning disability, and that's called dyscalculia. And it's I think the general or oversimplified definition of that is that it's dyslexia with numbers, but it's a lot different like that. I don't have a severe case. Some people have a severe case of this. And so for them, they can't tell time with analog clocks, is a little bit weird, or they have other issues. But I have, I think, 8 of the 9 symptoms or something like that, which is interesting. But again, because I was driven, right, and to this day, I really wish that math classes were taught like our physical science classes. So, for example, in physics class, right, I enjoyed understanding the working the numbers only because there's something I can physically see and understand, or the phenomena that we can observe. The statistical analysis, for example, of any chemistry or biology tests and things like that were always fun for me to do because I saw some real value in its usage and application. And so, that's another reason why I think shop class being gone is, truly a waste, really a sad thing.
So what happened? Where did you end up going to school?
After high school, for me, I went to junior college. I actually applied for scholarships and grants during my high school because I did have a good high school counselor at La Quinta. So going back to my bashing of La Quinta High School, you know what? I do have to say my guidance counselor back then was okay because he did. And I think his name was Mr. Allen, would help me. And he showed me a whole bunch of scholarship opportunities for me to apply. And so I did that. I ended up qualifying for two of them in California State Scholarship and Cal Grant. I think it's called Cal Grant B. I don't even know if they're still offered. But it was based on financial need. So yeah, my parents needed the financial help. And I got one. So I chose Cal Grant B because it was more money. But it also required me to go to a junior college first. But that was okay for me because I still didn't quite know what I wanted to do, right? Because my math skills were kind of not that great. But I did love the physical sciences, right? I considered engineering at one time, electrical engineering in specific, but, again, math. So I didn't know what to do. So I took the opportunity and got rid of or took care of the general education requirements, right? So after that, and again, yes, indeed, at Golden West College, there was the tower, and I think there was a tower and a tribander in one of the buildings. I never was able to find out where that was or who did or what that was. Too bad. But to be honest with you, I really wanted to get out of junior college as fast as I could because I quickly discovered in many of my classes that it really wasn't what I expected. And I wanted to sort of get away from those, the 2-year experience and move on to a real college, a 4-year college. And of course, my choice was always UCLA. Because George, and goes back to my friend George, who's now KJ6WZ, and I would hang out, quite often in Westwood and the UCLA campus area. So, but one of the other pulls for me was noticing the giant 4-element tri-band quad and 2 elements on 40 on top of the engineering building called Bolter Hall, right? So, giant skyscraper, penthouse floor, giant antenna. And I go, I had to meet those guys. I had to find out what this was as soon as possible because I had, this is because I had a ham license for a long time, but it was never on the air. And of course, back then, right, the license was not a 10-year license, right? It expired. So I had to reapply. Let's see, what is it? The operator and station license are 2 different things for U.S. ham radio operators. So I lost my call sign, but the operator license was still valid. So I just reapplied and got a new call sign. And so my new call sign as a novice was a Kilo Alpha 6 call, KH6WZ. And on CW, that sounded really, really neat. So for the guys who know code, you know what I'm talking about. And the pattern is sometimes really useful when digging out your call in a DX pilot. So KH6WZ was a really fun call to have. And that was on the air. Actually, that was on the air sometime because I would operate out of the UCLA Ham Radio Club, W6YRA. And at one time, I think I was president of that Ham Radio Club. And of course, all the guys were engineering students, right? Because it was in the engineering building on the engineering side of the campus. But I was not an engineering major. Remember this. So I think at UCLA, I had something like 12 different declared majors because, like I said, I still didn't know quite what to do. I was getting really, really close to violating a policy or a rule in the UC system, and that is having too many units and not qualifying for a degree. So that kind of scared me. Once again, motivation, either quit or let's get the degree. And so not by choice, but more like by chance, I graduated with a sociology. Again, moving away from numbers and things like that, and from the physical sciences over to the social sciences.
And now this message from ICOM America. Ham for the holidays. ICOM's new ID52A and IC705 give hours of fun and enjoyment working your favorite bands this holiday season. ICOM's newest handheld amateur radio is the ID52A. The ID52A is a larger radio with a larger color display and louder audio. This VHF-UHF digital transceiver is much more than a replacement for the ID51A, but it also is a new way of communicating. The color display is 2.3 inches for exceptional viewability, and the audio is 80% louder. This multifunction dual-band D-Star transceiver supports DR mode for easy access to local repeaters based on internal GPS information as well as terminal access point modes. The ID52A has Bluetooth for audio and data control, providing improved mobility and control. And for the first time in amateur radio industry, you can now send photos from a connected Android device. Other features include wideband receiver with guaranteed ranges of 144 to 148 MHz and 440 to 450 MHz. It has a VV, UU, VU, and dual DV mode, integrated GPS receiver, including grid square location, micro SD card slot, micro USB for data transfer, programming, and charging, and it's IPX7 waterproof. The ID52A is the perfect companion to the IC705. Both use compatible batteries and headsets, and you can also use the same Android app for D-Store operation. The IC705 is the perfect sidekick to the ID52A for hams that like to enjoy what both the great indoors and outdoors have to offer. This is the perfect QRP companion, base station features and functionality at the tip of your fingers in a portable package covering HF 6 meters, 2 meters, 70 centimeters. This compact rig weighs in at just over 2 pounds with RF direct sampling for most of the HF band and IF sampling for frequencies above 25 megahertz. Other features include 4.3-inch touchscreen with live band scope and waterfall, 5 watts out with a BP272 battery pack, and 10 watts with 13.8 volts DC supplied. Single sideband CW, AM, FM, as well as full D-Star functions, touchscreen display, micro USB connector, Bluetooth and wireless LAN, integrated GPS with antenna and GPS logger, micro SD card slot, speaker microphone. The HM243 comes standard. Supports QRP and QRPP operations. The perfect accessory for the IC705 is, of course, the optional backpack, the LC192, with a special compartment for your IC705 and room for accessories for soda activations or a day of social distancing in the park. The IC705 is now shipping. Follow the link in the ICOM banner ad in this week's show notes, or go to www.icomamerica.com/amateur for more information on these fine rigs. My thanks to ICOM America for sponsorship of the QSO Today podcast. And now back to our QSO. Wayne, you're telling my story. I had the same problem at UC Santa Barbara. I got married the summer before my senior year, and my wife said, you've been at this school for 7 years. I think you need to declare a major and get out. I'm listening here smiling as you're telling the story because this is exactly what happened to me. Okay, so you have this degree in sociology, but it doesn't appear to me that, at least from your professional resume, that you ever spent any time in sociology. What happened after that?
No, I didn't. And this is also what I tell people when I'm counseling people about college. And, now there's this sort of a bad trend about, or the question about, is a college diploma or university diploma worth anything, especially because of the cost involved and how much student debt is out there. But I always say, look, the thing for me, and I think the thing for everybody with a college degree that makes us different, even if it's a 4-year degree, is the need to have goal setting, learning research methods, and understanding about the world. I mean, that's what general education is all about in the college programs, right? And I still, to this day, remember this very, very old full-page newspaper ad that ran in the Hartford Current. And that's another story, part of my history that we'll get into. But it was a full-page ad about the reason college education is valuable. And I can't for the life of me remember it, but some examples included things like, sure, you might not remember how to solve that quadratic equation, but you do know that they exist, and you know that the results of these, the math involved is useful in everyday life, because back in there is the analysis of marketing and so forth. You might not be able to recite that Shakespeare sonnet, but you do understand they exist, and you have been exposed and understand the beauty of a Shakespearean sonnet. And there's this, like I said, it was a full-page ad, went on and on about what happens or what you're exposed to when you go through that college journey. And that, and of course, a lot of it is living on your own and paying bills and becoming a responsible young adult. And a lot of times that's missing from some of the non-com. For example, I have several nieces and nephews who didn't go to, still not quite sure why that happened, but they're different. And it's hard to explain. But getting back to my career, yes, it taught me, and all of my roommates were, I had a poli-sci, political science major roommate. I had a business roommate, and I had another one. I can't remember what major he was, but here's the thing. I had papers in every single one of my classes, and most of these guys had no research papers to do. I said, I'm going crazy spending hours and hours doing research papers for all of my classes. And these guys go through classes without doing any research papers. But the fact of doing all the research, and back then, you had to go to the library and look at real books to do research, or publications, and do your own research and create these papers. So that got me into the discipline and the activity of studying and reading and formulating decisions and formulating hypotheses or arguments to support your claim. And so that in itself was what my degree in sociology helped me to create a career in the field of what might be called journalism, right? Because it's the writing and research and understanding facts and understanding how to interpret facts and figures and reporting them into some distinctive way. So my first job out of college, right, the term around the college campus at UCLA for seniors and juniors and seniors probably was get a real job. And that usually meant, a real job is when you work at some office and you don't have to wear a plastic name tag with your name on. So get a real job. So there you go. My first job, by the way.
Unless you worked in aerospace.
Then it's an ID badge, but that's something else, right? It's not the same as Bob in that plastic thing, or Wayne, your Wayne tag. I suppose it's better than being called Hey You to come here. So my first job, and this is again ham radio related, of course. So when I got to college, I graduated, and I was one of the statistics at the time of college graduates being unemployed. Now, I wasn't in debt, right, because I had my scholarships and my grants. I did work study. Had a lot of really interesting jobs, by the way. And yes, a lot of more electronics and ham radio. I got a job assembling high voltage circuit boards for the physics department for some high voltage experiment. Never knew what the thing was. It was a very unusual thing with multiple PC boards and soldering a lot of high voltage capacitors all over the place. And then we had to clean them in an ultrasonic cleaner. And that was the scary part. We're moving on a tangent, but I think this could be a fun story. So here I am, a sociology major in the physics lab, soldering these components. And then the step was to clean them in the ultrasonic cleaner, which was heated. And so understand I can't remember what kind of alcohol it was, but, I think at one time I saw the ultrasonic cleaner steaming. There's actually visible vapor coming up. And they connected it to a gray lab timer, so then it would be washed for a certain amount of time. Then we were supposed to remove the PC board and scrub off the rest of the residue. Well, I told the supervisor, who was, of course, not a ham, but a physics guy, but I'm not sure if he understood what happens when you heat alcohol and you have this gray lab timer, which has some kind of timer in it, which switches on or off the ultrasonic cleaner. I said, when you have this flammable vapor and there's a switch inside this, or relay inside this timer, and if it were to create a spark, do you think we'll have an explosion? And the guy said, don't worry about it. Well, one day, we were doing this procedure, and one day I noticed coming into work some sort of yellow sticky powder all over the floor and all over the lab. Guess what happened? Yeah, something exploded. I don't think the guy who was there that was close to the cleaner got hurt, but the story goes that, yeah, he had to change his pants. So once again, here I am. I'm the kid, English major, don't know what I'm talking about. But I said, somebody better be careful, I didn't say I told you so, but I just shook my head and went back to work. Anyway, bad things. So my sociology degree led me to my first job out of college, which is ham radio related. Of course, I landed a job at ARRL headquarters in Newington, Connecticut. So, like I said, I was one of the unemployed college graduates reading QST one day and noticing classified in QST saying, looking for, and I can't remember the position, but I did not get that position I applied for, but I had a really nice letter. And it said that although we filled this position, we have another position that's similar to this one. Would I be interested? And they asked me to send, writing sample and that kind of stuff by mail, and got the job. The title was Assistant Public Information Officer. I reported to Peter Odell.
So what happened there? How long were you there?
Oh, that was neat. I mean, it's kind of neat working at headquarters, right? Because I read QST magazine since I was a kid, right? So it's kind of neat to see or actually meet these people that you read about, right? Or have these columns in QST magazine. Paul Pagel, for example, N1FB. Doug DeMaw. No, I think I got there. McCoy actually retired before I got there. But I did know Doug DeMaw. Doug DeMaw was N1FB, Paul Pagel, all kinds of staffers from 1982, 1983, 1984. So I spent 2 years there. And working at Leaf headquarters, it was interesting for me because here's a place where 100% of one's life is centered on ham radio. So I met all kinds of other people that you'd never see in the CQ magazine because they're staffers, right? But they're still very dedicated hams. But the sense of humor gets kind of warped. I mean, one of the most famous sayings in The Office, it turns into a ham radio joke or a ham radio reference, right? So it's, hey, don't write this or don't say this too loud because what's his name will go into grid current. Watch that grid current go. So for people who haven't had the pleasure of tuning an HF radio tube finals, you have to understand plate and dip, or the peak and dip. And I guess we can let people Google that those terms then, right, to understand how to tune a tube amplifier final and understanding what the dangers of grid current mean. And then relating that to somebody's attitude or emotion goes up. I guess the equivalent could be rising blood pressure.
Let's segue a little bit here. You spoke at the last QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo in August on building and contesting on 10 gigahertz. So how did you get involved in micro?
That's a great question. My ham radio experience, I'm not able to say that I've tried all the modes that are offered or available on ham radio, but I've done a lot. So, yeah, and a lot of them centered on building things, right? Because remember, my earliest ham electronics experience was always about building things. And so my aspects of ham radio sort of centered on building things. So the first thing that comes to mind is QRP, right? Yeah, you can, turn your power control and your radio down to like 5 or 10. But most of the QRP guys are home brewers, right? So I started off with that. And, building stuff is fun, but when you spend all that time and build this nice 40-meter CW QRP, and then you connect it to a dipole, and then you can't work anybody, things kind of get disappointing. I've built 40-meter radios, 20-meter radios. Of course, all of them are CW rigs because you're QRP, so you want some advantage on that thing. But it's still not really enjoyable because getting back to that ham radio experience from UCLA's Radio Club, that giant 4-element quad and 2 elements on 40, it's so nice to hear a CQ and call them and they can hear you, right? Or calling CQ and somebody. When you're on QRP, it's a bit challenging, especially when you have a dipole. Now, we should probably be careful because I know there are a lot of QRP guys who are actually have success. But for me, it just wasn't really effective. So I've also tried transmitter hunting, right? Fox hunting, because once again, it's home brewing aspect there. So I did that. Of course, met Joe along the way, Joe Mole.
Also in Orange County.
And he's also been on the podcast. So kind of a neat thing there. I got into tea hunting, did that, just made my little active attenuator. And then one day I decided, and here's another thing too. One day my active attenuator broke. I can't remember what happened, but something happened. And so rather than stop or quit, I decided to just try this. Instead of using this, I disconnected the antenna and I would hold the two connectors, right? And I separated them apart with my fingers in between to attenuate the signal. And then as I wanted to vary the attenuation, I would change the distance between the two connectors on the antenna lead. And so that instead of using an active attenuator, I was able to vary the signal separating or disconnecting the antenna and just changing and managed to find the missing transmitter. But same thing, that got a little boring for me too. No offense to tea hunters and fox hunters out there, because I can understand how enjoyable that is. Kind of fun.
Where did you do that?
I think my last tea hunt was with Joe and April, and I'm going to say it was a park in Fullerton. I can't remember. It's been many, many years since I've done that, though. A long time.
Did you do the transmitter hunting in the car, where you'd start on a hilltop in Palos Verdes or Tustin, spend the entire night chasing a transmitter?
Yeah, no, this was an on-foot transmitter hunt.
They call those fox hunts in Europe, right?
The way we do it here, or at least my experience, is definitely not like the ones in Europe or in Asia. But I did build that tape measure antenna. Still have it. Still have my the active offset attenuator. Still have that. It's all in a quick go box, right? So, but the same thing. I didn't get into it too much, but then I discovered 10 gigahertz, and my discovery of 10 gigahertz is kind of weird because I had started off as a field day exercise, meaning after field day, after every field day, I always tried to do an assessment. What went wrong, what went right, what do we want to do for next year in terms of building up our score or making things more efficient. And I thought, well, look, what if we changed frequency bands, and what if we added, something like, I don't know, 10 gigahertz or some microwave frequency into this thing. No, it's not a multiplier, but it is a different band. So it could be more points, right? So I started researching into the microwaves and discovered and chose 10 gigahertz as my first band. And that continues to this day as my favorite mode, my most interested favorite mode. And sorry, but I don't have a picture of my shack because my shack is a portable microwave station. I suppose I can show you a picture of the back of my car in the trunk of the gear inside, or set up the unit on a tripod and here's my station. But with antenna restrictions, right? I live in a place where I can't put up any antennas. This is one answer, and it actually answers two things, if not more, for me and my ham radio preferences. One, it's building something, right? You can't just go to the store and buy a 10 gigahertz radio. You can buy a 10 gigahertz transverter, but you still have to interface it with what we call the IF radio, which is an all-mode VHF UHF. So there's still quite a bit of building.
Let me take a quick break to tell you about my favorite amateur radio audio podcast, and that's the Ham Radio Workbench podcast with George, KJ6VU, Jeremy, KF7IJZ, and it now includes Michael Walker, VA3MW, where they pursue topics, technology, and projects on their ham radio workbenches every 2 weeks. The group documents their projects and makes circuit boards available to their listeners. They have interesting guests and go in deep. Jeremy may complain about the overall length of the podcast, but friends, let me tell you that I could listen to it all day, and that's good. Even if you are a seasoned ham radio builder or just getting started, be sure to join George, Jeremy, and Mike now for the Ham Radio Workbench podcast on every podcast player. Use the link on this week's show notes page by clicking on the image. And now back to our QSO today. The jump from building QRP radios to deciding that you're going to do 10 gigahertz for field day, that's a huge jump. Did you actually have to find an organization, or did you join an organization, or did you find some mentors or peers that were already doing 10 gigahertz in order to be able to pull that one off? Or were you just confident that, with enough research you could do it yourself?
Oh, that's a great question, because I actually wrote about this in one of my CQ magazine columns. It's called Successful Failure. So the answer is yes to all of the above. I did a lot of research, but I also had to find other people who've done it before. I discovered the San Bernardino Radio Club, San Bernardino Microwave Society, SBMS, through a Google search. And turns out that it was quite a drive from Orange County to over there. And at the time, I was doing a lot of volunteer work with the City of Huntington Beach RACES group for emergency communication. That's Huntington. And a friend of mine with the RACES group, I decided that why not go to a meeting and see what else is out there, especially this microwave thing, and especially if it helps us on field day. It's probably, a 2-hour drive from Orange County in traffic, at least. So we drove up there, and interestingly enough, once again, how small the world is, in the very first meeting I attended, I joined on the spot because there were more than several people that I already knew in my ham radio experience, right? One of them was Mike Ramirez, W6YLZ. I've known Mike. I know Mike through our friend George, KJ6VU. So I've known this guy, Mike, W6YLZ, since I was, a kid, and he was a member of the club. And also present at the meeting was Chip Angle in 6CA, very famous VHF, UHF contester, builder, and highly skilled and technical. I think because of those two guys I already knew, and because I already knew of their reputation, and because I met other microwave, contester guys, I joined that club on the spot with no ifs or buts. I can't remember the year, but it's probably close to, 8, 9, maybe it might be 10 years. I'll have to check. So yeah, my very first rig was a disaster. I'm not going to call it a disaster. Like I said, I call it a successful failure because I learned a lot. I did a lot of it on my own, but with some help, not a lot. But it didn't make any QSOs. I mean, I think I could receive, but didn't transmit or something like that. But because I'm a builder, right, and this whole phenomenon at Maker Faire is something old. Some people think the Maker is new, but it really isn't. Any ham radio guy knows. I kept improving things, right? And the challenge of getting something like that is satisfying to me, right? And so I think part of the draw for me, because I get this question all the time from people who are not ham radios operators or are not exposed to ham radio. They say, does that thing still exist? Is ham radio still valid? Do people still do ham radio? I mean, we have cell phones, right? What's the big deal? And I tell them it's so much more. And it's also the same thing when I meet people in public service aspects of ham radio. And I think that's, in my personal experience, I don't know if this is universally true or true everywhere else, but the biggest push in new ham radio folks are the guys who are interested in public service, right? Emergency communication. What happens when we have that big earthquake and something happens? My cell phone's not going to work. All that stuff. And especially here in Southern California, we've got earthquakes and fires and things like this. And other parts of the world and the country, yeah, there are other natural disasters, but it's the same thing. But when I talk to a lot of these public service-minded people, they're only exposed to meter HT repeaters. And I always tell them, look, there's so much more to ham radio. And if you're willing to take a look, I'll show you some of the things that we can do. And it is just so amazing. And that was part of my drive for participating as a demonstrator maker in Maker Fairs here in Southern California and Northern California. And unfortunately, those are now gone. And I think they're still online, but it's still not the same, right? The Bay Area Maker.
Because of the pandemic, of course.
Well, actually, the Bay Area Maker Faire, the biggie in the U.S., and there are two. There are lots of regional ones, but the Bay Area Maker Faire in San Mateo, California, is the biggest one and the very first one. The other event for the East Coast guys is what's called the World Maker Faire in New York City. I'm not sure if the World Maker Faire in New York City is still going on, but the Bay Area Maker Faire, right? The event that started it all is no longer. And last year, 2019. It was the last one, and that's just so disappointing and sad for me.
Well, but that's because of the pandemic, not because of loss of interest, right?
No, mostly the public reason, and I'm still not sure. Well, let's say the news release or the information that comes from Maker Faire was that they were not able to make enough money to continue.
No, unbelievable.
I kind of believe that because, yeah, it actually is believable because when a person participates in Maker Faire as a maker or person who exhibits, everything is free. And the venue is a public space. And if anyone knows anything about any trade shows, you know that a 10-foot booth space can be very, very expensive because, and by the way, everything you need to support your exhibit is free, right? So your AC, your electricity is free. If you needed compressed gas, yeah, that's free. If you wanted anything to support your high voltage experience and you need 3-phase electricity at 220 volts, yeah, they can get that for you. And it's all. And so if anybody understands the cost of putting on a trade show and the amount of cost, it's pretty huge. And that's one of the reasons why I as soon as I found out about Maker Faire, I decided, a deal like this and the opportunity it presents, let's do it. Now, they started getting commercial exhibitors, which helped somewhat, but I think they may have done that too late. I also wanted to suggest to the Maker Faire people that why not use the Maker Faire as a career or a job search opportunity or recruitment opportunity, right? To recruit people who are doing these things. Now, people who exhibit, understand that Maker Faire is not only technical and electronic. It is anything and everything. The concept is make instead of buy, fix or repair instead of throw away, which is the really basic core concept. And that started changing. I noticed that several years ago, and I thought this was kind of weird. Maker Faire is all about making, and yet now there are commercial companies that are displaying, and now they're selling stuff. And I said, doesn't that sort of defeat the purpose and definition?
Wayne, I also was looking at your YouTube videos, and I'll put the links online, about you took movies of things at the Maker Faire. And what was interesting to me was that while some of the physical concepts of the larger stuff that was outside that you were showing was interesting from a physics standpoint, it also appeared to me that it was beginning to look like that thing out in the desert, every summer, Burning Man. It started looking like these were pre-Burning Man technologies that were being tried at Maker Faire before they were sent out to the desert. Was that your impression as well?
Actually, no. Although I can tell you this, a lot of the giant displays and all the pyrotechnical displays or whatever you want to call it, yes, a lot of them are directly from or the same guys who display the same things at Burning Man. But that's okay. For me, it was exciting because I'm not able to get to Burning Man, although it is on my list. There's some other things I want to go to too, right? Rockstock is another one, but that's a whole nother story.
I had a question about the maker movement, and since you brought it up, we got out of microwave. And I guess we could spend more time in microwave, but you're an interesting guy, so there's a lot to talk about. I'm sorry to hear that the maker movement seems to be going away. It seems to me that people will pitch tents to attend a Walmart sale on the one hand, and yet they're not necessarily interested in building or recycling anything. But as an active guy who was involved in the maker movement, you made a presentation called Not Your Grandpa's Ham Radio at the Bay Area Maker Faire. As a ham radio community, and as a guy who's been involved in ham radio journalism and community for years and years now, are we missing an opportunity to build our ham radio numbers by not putting more efforts towards the maker community?
The answer is yes. Short answer, very short answer is the answer is yes. By the way, let's be clear. The Maker Faire in the Bay Area is gone, discontinued, but the Maker movement itself still continues. In fact, there's an organization now, I think they converted everything over to Maker Community, and I think it's maker.co, and if that's not accurate, I can find the link for you so you can post it. Yeah, and so everybody's doing it online, which is still okay, but it just isn't the same when you can actually see it and go close. There's a great sign. There's a great warning sign in one of the dangerous exhibits. It says something like "Danger, flammable, come closer," something like that. But that's sort of the thing that you see at Maker Faire.
we're always lamenting, and I guess if you go back in ham radio history, as part of the QSO Today podcast, I do a lot of research, and I'll go back into old QST magazines. They're lamenting in the 50s that we're not getting more young people. Now, in the 50s and 60s, they got a lot of young people. This tends to be the continual cry throughout the history of ham radio that we just aren't replacing our numbers, and we're not doing it with young people. It seems to me that we're always looking in the bottom of the same barrel for new hams rather than looking at ways to sell ham radio. So when you said earlier that, and they say it to me too, when I say I'm involved in ham radio, they'll go, oh, is that still around? Do people still do that? It seems to me that the maker community should be the target because one of the great things about ham radio is that we are makers, and it extends from DC to blue light that we're making. I don't see a lot of traction in the amateur radio community towards the maker community as the source of our new hams. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's something I've been thinking about for a long time, especially now that I'm older. I still remember conversations I've had with some when I was pretty young in the industry. I would talk to other company representatives of ham radio equipment, and these older guys would tell me about how sad it is to know that so-and-so is now a silent key, or so-and-so from this company is a silent key, or so-and-so is gone now. And I think this problem with replacing or getting new blood into the hobby is still not limited to just ham radio. It's actually, I think it's actually a problem with all kinds of other pursuits, including, recreational things like sports, skiing, for example, or golfing, for example. And the other thing I wonder about is whatever happened to stamp collecting as well, right? When I was a kid, I did that. But now that we have self-adhesive, forever stamps, what's happening to stamp collecting? I think every pursuit has these issues. And for ham radio in particular, I think part of it is simply being exposed when a person is a kid, right? It can't start with, hey, you want to know about this or you want to learn about this. It's a push versus pull type of thing. And that's why I always thought Maker Faire was possibly the greatest thing that could happen to ham radio, right? And it's up there with possibly with the no code license chain, as well as the ham in space missions, because part of that ham in space mission is about educational aspects of getting hams in space. Those are the two events that were really huge to give a boost to ham radio. Maker fairs or the maker movement, yes, absolutely. They are a prime target. And I am, quite frankly, shocked at how much of, and I could be wrong, and I would love to hear, responses to this observation. And I really wish, the ham radio folks would pay more attention to the maker fairs or the maker movements or the maker community. I started writing about maker fairs in CQ magazine for quite some time, probably before I saw things in QST magazine. No offense to headquarters, but, just saying. But yes, the maker community could be a huge opportunity. I mean, look at the Dayton Hamvention, for example. And yes, I know the COVID-19 lockdown has had an effect, but why not? Since Maker Faire is gone, wouldn't it be nice to have the people in charge of the Maker Faire get together with the people in charge of the Dayton Hamvention and maybe allocate some space for maker projects? And do they have to be ham radio? Maybe, maybe not. I think they can't be too crazily away from ham radio, but I think they could be ham radio-like. High voltage things, maybe, computer interfacing, maybe, those type of things, right? Microcontrollers, Arduinos are very huge. So the answer is yes. And I think what tends to happen is this. This is sort of what happens in education, right, in career paths for people. When kids are young, they have to have some kind of awareness that something exists, right? Otherwise, they will never understand that it's out there. For me, for example, I discovered ham radio on my own by just looking at magazines or things like this and taking things apart. Or when the TV repairman would come, yes, we had TV repairmen come to the house and fix the TV set when it was broke. and just enjoying talking to the guy.
With his big tube carrier.
That's right. And his big mirror. And I helped him hold the flashlight and things like this, right? One has to be exposed to these things. And that in itself is going to be the biggest thing. Like I said, the question, is ham radio still around? To me, baffles me, because the answer to that is yes, but it demonstrates that people are still not aware that it even exists. And so that's really what needs to happen. So yes, maybe if we get somehow ham radio into the more popular culture, right? Maybe movies, TV shows. I mean, if you look at old Twilight Zones, yeah, there's, I think, one episode out of all of them that mentions ham radio, and the ham radio guy is kind of, a bad guy in the.
Well, I think Last Man Standing has done a great job of presenting ham radio, but it's one television show. But it seems to me that maybe even the ARRL probably needs to do some public service announcements, if those are even available on network television. But then who watches network television anymore? It's a very interesting thing. One of the things that you brought up, and at least I'm thinking about as you're speaking, is that your whole ham radio story is my story. Putting my head in the back of the television and smelling the electronics. Now, it might have been hot dust that we were smelling, but when you're a kid, there's a sense of wonder that you have, an awe-inspiring sense that electronics had, so it became this perfume that you always smelled and that you were always attracted to. For any listeners that joined ham radio in your 30s and 40s and 50s, God love you. We need those bodies. And those people that come in at age 30 are going to, if they live, God willing, to a long life, they'll be ham radio operators for 50 years. And I guess that's what the maker community seems to me has the possibility. There's a chance to get a kid, male or female, it doesn't matter, a sense of awe, a sense of like, this is awe-inspiring, and that a smartphone is not awe-inspiring, and a lot of the technology that people have in their homes is no longer awe-inspiring, although if you know how it works, it's quite awe-inspiring. But it seems to me that there's the opportunity, so that when you bring up something like Dayton, and I'm hesitant to make any criticism of any expos because I'm now a target as an expo provider, but a lot of the families that come to Dayton, if they came with the whole family, you could have a whole exhibition that's maker that is even not electronic, so that those family members who are not hams could also enjoy the expo. What do you think about that?
That's a very good point. As you were talking, I was about to say that. As a person who went to Dayton Hamvention, and yes, it truly is amazing, I think it has to be on every ham's bucket list. And it not only has to be on every ham's bucket list, and you cannot go to Dayton only once. You must go to the Dayton Hamvention at least twice, okay? Because it's just like going to Disneyland. You cannot go to Disneyland and see it all in one day. You must go multiple times. So I tell people, when you have to go to Dayton, because it is probably, it absolutely is for us here in the U.S., it is the place to go if you're involved in ham radio. And don't go once, because it's impossible to develop an opinion about the Hamvention by going just, and maybe it has to be 3 times, because there's the whole list of guest speakers and presenters and the new equipment. You just cannot do it in one sitting, and maybe not even in 2. But as a person who went to Dayton Hamvention as an employee of a radio company, and I've been to some 13 Dayton Hamvention. This is back when there was still Hara Arena. Your observation about when a family comes and they bring their kids, it's so horrible for the kids, because as I watched people, the parents, either it's the dad or the mom, dragging the kids by the arm and pulling them. And of course, the kids are wailing because they're bored as heck. And there's nothing for the kids to do. And I always felt sorry for that aspect of these radio conventions, no matter where they are. So for me, since I'm not in the ham radio industry, I can probably say this because it's only my personal opinion. But the answer is absolutely, we need some kind of kids activity, and it should not be daycare. It should be something more fun and interesting, because right now, I think this possibly could be the reason why some people don't like ham radio, because they remember a childhood experience which might have been traumatic, right? I mean, it's almost like going shopping, for clothes when you're a kid, and you don't want to be there. You got to be dragged around, and you have to try things on, and it's horrible. Why not make it a really fun experience? And yes, having some kind of activity geared for kids is something that really needs to happen. Otherwise, quite possibly, like I said, it turns into a traumatic experience, and they don't like ham radio. I mean, I know a lot of people, right, with family members, and especially if ham radio comes up sometimes, somebody will say, yeah, my dad was a ham, and he all spent time in the garage or the basement talking to strangers, and he wouldn't come out, all this kind of stuff. So it's a negative experience for kids. It's pretty rare that I'll hear somebody say, yep, my dad was a ham, he enjoyed it, I loved it, he got me into it, yeah. So I don't know. I think every ham needs to be an ambassador, right? So this is the call to action of the definition of ham radio and what it's about. It's all about mentoring, right, or Elmering. And that was the emphasis. That's the other emphasis of the maker movement, of other people helping people and bringing things into the open. In fact, Maker Faire encouraged people to bring their projects in anyway, even if they weren't working, because you can have other people take a look and suggest solutions. And everybody in the maker movement thinks, oh, wow, what a neat idea. And I keep telling people, it's not a new idea. Hams have been doing this for over 100 years. And so once again, it's a PR thing, PR issue that, our league headquarters should be more active on. And yes, as an ex-league employee and as the public information officer, it was sort of my responsibility to participate in getting the word out. So once again, the Hammond Space Mission, the W5LFL Owen Garriott mission, the STS-9 mission that I participated in, right, was probably the hugest boost. And I think it still remains today because it was the first.
Those maker displays, this is elementary to ham radio operators, but simple electricity, simple plumbing, simple anything. It seems to me, and I see this even with adults here in Israel, that nobody knows how anything works. Nobody knows how the electricity is generated and sent to your house anymore. It seemed to me that everybody knew that when we were growing up, but it seems like nobody knows that now. Or how water gets to your house. I'm involved in a water tunnel project here. You have tens of millions of gallons that have to be pumped up into the Jerusalem area. Nobody knows how that happens. They think it just happens. They just turn it on. Those are fascinating technologies, and even with the basics, I think those things could also be put into a pavilion at the Dayton Hamvention for those bored kids who are not into ham radio yet, or maybe never be, but at least they'll learn something about the things that we take for granted every day that are really quite amazing technical miracles.
Right, and I think you hit something, and maybe maybe we need a PBS, public television documentary on ham radio and its history, or ham radio and what's happening today. And I call upon ARRL headquarters to lead that and have ARRL HQ reach out into all of the ham radio member organizations across the world to do the same thing and put together one awesome show about why ham radio is not only awesome but useful, especially now as we start losing, right, ham radio privileges in our frequency allocation. And so it's beyond use it or lose it, because, the biggest issue is, commercial. I mean, it's amazing how much revenue can be generated by these frequency allocations. So you can't use that argument of its value in terms of dollars and cents. We have to look at it in terms of its value, in terms of technology and experimentation and the free aspect of what hams can, and the importance of maintaining all of these abilities to have access to these frequencies.
What do you think the greatest challenge is facing amateur radio now in that context?
Yeah, there's a couple of them. And for the longest time, especially for me, and I think everybody here, at least in the U.S., are the restrictions against ham radio antennas, the CCNR, the HOA, or whatever you want to call it, or zoning restriction. Back when I was at the league headquarters in the early 80s, we all talked about PRB1. Federal preemption of what's happening to them. It still continues to be an issue of why hams cannot like why licensed hams cannot erect an antenna structure. If it's safe. I mean, sure, aesthetics is everything, right? I have a friend who lives in Palos Verdes, and he put up a small vertical for his 2-meter FM radio, and it was a Ringo. I don't know if it was a Ringo or Ringo Ranger. He mounted it on a balcony on his railing, and some neighbor complained because it obstructed the view. Now, understand that a Ringo Ranger or Ringo, I can't remember which one it is a slim aluminum pipe or tube. And the neighbor complained because it obstructed the... Now, to a ham, any antenna is beautiful, right?
Right.
Other people, we have to figure out some ways to combat those issues and understand, right? What happens if, take that antenna down, now he's no longer able to communicate, with his radio set. What happens if there's a fire or an earthquake? The telephone, the landline, cell phones are jammed and cannot be used. You have asked this guy to take away this public service aspect of emergency communications out. And so what are you going to do? And people can't get past it's kind of ugly. It obstructs my view.
Don't you think it's incumbent on that ham, if he's going to use that as an excuse, that he actually should be involved in a local ARES or something like that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The other thing, too, is the ham should be responsible for installing the antenna system safely and as aesthetically as possible, if that is possible. Maybe paint the thing white or some other color, or maybe mount it in a corner. It does not obstruct it. Other alternative.
It comes to mind that there's something else that could be done. If a person is a representative of his local ARES, why doesn't he canvass his neighborhood and say, I'm involved in the amateur radio emergency service? Maybe there's a checklist, a safety checklist, a communications checklist, or something like that he could use to build awareness in his neighborhood about the fact that there actually exists an emergency system that works if everything else doesn't work. And certainly there's lots of video and history of where amateur radios played this amazing role because everything else got blown away. What do you think about that?
I believe that's part of the solution to this issue. But this is a whole big topic in itself. And I think we should probably find a couple of guests to talk about these issues, right, and solution.
You're going to help me, Wayne. I've decided you're going to help me with this.
I might be able to have a few names and call signs for you, yeah.
I think this is a discussion that if we want to advocate, I know we like to have our organizations advocate for us, but, we're 800,000 in America. We're maybe 2 million in the world, perhaps. If we want to be noticed, then I think that we actually have to, all of us, in some way, have to do the public relations for amateur radio. And maybe it's too big of a task to put on a single organization or a single national organization in order to do that for us. If you had advice for new or returning hams, what kind of advice would you give them now?
There's probably two parts to that. This is probably a two-part answer. Let's start with, the old-timers who have not played around with ham radio for a while. And I know several of these guys who keep their license, right, but are not active. I always tell people, go back to what brought you to ham radio in the first place. Why did you bother to, study and learn about ham radio, and why did you take the exam and buy the equipment? And now here it is, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years later, 10 years later, and all of a sudden you're just off the air, not doing anything. And I ask people, what happened? And a couple of things happen, right? Depending on a person's age, it's family obligations, etc. Well, I always tell people, well, why don't you get your family involved, especially with kids, because there's a huge educational aspect of ham radio. And it's not only electronics technology, right? It's always about just getting kids curious to learn more and just being exposed to ham radio, and maybe they will enjoy it or like it. So for old timers, I usually say, what brought you to do this in the first place? For me, like I said, it's always been about building something. And so, QRP kits, yes, there's all kinds of things to build, especially now. CQ Magazine, for example, has a kit building column. And so take a look at some of the publications and take a look at what we're doing now in terms of building. Surface mount technology is doable in one's home lab. it's not something to be afraid of. Point to point is still there. I mean, there's a huge resurgence in people building tube radios once again from old issues of QST or other publications. So there's that aspect. Certainly there's the aspect of restoring projects, right? One of the things I do, I take old Heathkit units and I completely disassemble them, basically creating turning them once again into kits, and then cleaning everything and refurbishing everything and making them work again. I've got several pieces of test equipment and ham radio equipment from Heathkit that I've restored and are back on the air. So I usually ask an old timer, what made you drop ham radio, and think about what brought you into this hobby in the first place, and think about ways that we can get back into it in today's terms. For new people that are into ham radio, let's talk about this, right? Now, like I said, in my experience, most of the new hams are coming from the public service aspect, which is very awesome, right? We need all of these emergency communicators out there. But I also try to encourage them to take a look and at least check out to see what that license means and what you can do with it. So for me, like I said, it's been a huge discovery of all kinds of things to do. There's huge satisfaction for me to do, and it continues to this day. And for all people, right, it's impact, especially if you have kids. And why not expose them to it? I mean, my ham radio experience as a kid has brought me some amazing opportunities in my career. And in fact, created a path, right, for me to develop interest. If I had not been involved in ham radio, I still wonder what I would have. Maybe I'd have a physics degree.
Wayne, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. It went in a different direction than I thought it might, but I think it went in a great direction, and I think it raises some questions and some, maybe not a lot of answers yet, but some questions in terms of how the ham radio community might extend itself into the non-ham radio community and be known better. With that, I want to thank you so much and wish you 73.
Thanks, Eric. I enjoyed being here. 73.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Wayne. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in KH6WZ in the search box at the top of the page. Be sure to click on the Expo menu item at the top of the page or in the middle of the show notes page for the updates on the upcoming QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo coming in March 2021. I'm updating it as I have more information. My thanks to ICOM America for its support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of ICOM America by clicking on their banner in the show notes pages. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any other episode into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages, or use my Amazon link before shopping at Amazon. Amazon gives me a small commission on your purchases while at the same time protecting your privacy. I'm grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as I head towards episode 400. QSO Today is now available in the iHeart Radio, Spotify, YouTube, and a bunch of other online audio services, including the iTunes Store. Look on the right side of the show notes pages for a listing of these services. You can use the Amazon Echo and say, Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn. My thanks to Ben Bresky, who edits every single show and allows both this host and my guest to sound brilliant. Thanks, Ben. Until next time, this is Eric, 4Z1UG, 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.